Good evening, Lawrance Pembroke here. Tonight, we journey into the plague years to uncover how ordinary people survived the Black Death without the help of modern medicine, and the surprising habits that carried them through. Historians believe the Black Death killed as much as half of Europe's population, but here's the part they often leave out. Many communities had survival rates far higher than others, and their secrets weren't written in books. They were passed hand to hand through superstition, whispers, and quiet acts of defiance against fear itself. Tonight, we follow those whispers through the winding streets of plague-era towns to uncover what they knew and what we've forgotten. Why did some people, in the midst of a plague, wrap themselves in the sharp scent of herbs or fill their homes with clouds of aromatic smoke? To walk the streets during an outbreak was to move through a haze of smells, some pleasant, some choking. And yet for many, the right scent felt like a shield. In narrow alleys where carts of bodies passed, figures would appear with small metal spheres, their delicate patterns hiding clumps of rosemary, sage, or clove. Others burned juniper in iron braziers, letting the smoke seep into every corner. Even the most ordinary worker might tuck lavender into a kerchief worn close to the mouth and nose. The air itself was considered an enemy. In busy market roads lined with shuttered stalls, the wealthy could be seen pacing with polished pomanders swinging from chains, a subtle perfume hovering about them. Across the same street, a grandmother would fuss over a rope of garlic bulbs hanging above the doorway, believing each breath pulled from them would keep sickness out. Every scent had meaning. Every ember-fueled plume of smoke held a measure of hope. The smell of scorched herbs drifted from upper windows where households kept fires going all day just to keep the foul vapors at bay. No one spoke of microbes or bacteria. They did not exist in the common mind. Instead, there was miasma, the idea that bad air carried death in it. The foulness of a rotting canal or the stench from a tanner's workshop was seen as more than unpleasant. It was thought to be dangerous, able to slide into the body and blacken the lungs. Against that unseen intruder, barriers of fragrance were deployed. Simple sprigs of mint or thyme were tucked into sleeves, and the heavy smoke from myrrh lingered in shops of apothecaries, surrounding their jars like a second skin. For richer households, there were bundles of cinnamon bark and sandalwood, burned not for warmth but for atmosphere, a controlled, perfumed cloud designed to push back what could not be seen. Even dinner tables changed. Dishes heavy with pepper and strong herbs were served not just for taste, but because the heat and spice felt like protection from the air. The poor made do with what grew nearby or could be scavenged. Garlic, wild sage, crushed juniper berries sold cheaply in cloth packets. Most believed entirely in the logic of the sense. They were a wall you could carry, an armor you could breathe through. But without knowing it, some of these choices had effects beyond belief. Fleas, the true vector of the plague, avoided certain strong-smelling oils and plants. Even if that wasn't enough to stop an outbreak in its tracks, it might slow the spread in a single household. People who kept bundles of pungent herbs under beds or in straw mattresses may have cut down the number of bites without ever understanding why. Daily routines took this thinking further. In crowded districts, some families burned aromatic fires each morning at the threshold, letting the scent drift down into the street, while merchants hung branches of evergreen over their stalls. The urban landscape changed during outbreaks. Smoke curled from chimneys all day, not just at mealtimes. Doorways bristled with branches. Colors dulled under a dusting of ash from constant burning. This was how fear shaped the look and smell of entire neighborhoods. Inside, rooms were arranged for the flow of scented air. Windows facing narrow lanes might be kept sealed, while the ones opening toward gardens or fields were propped wide to draw in what was thought to be clean breath. Herbs dangled from rafters like drying laundry, their oils released slowly over weeks, Candles made from beeswax infused with crushed bay or clove replaced plain tallow. Visitors entering a house often had a small bundle waved under their noses before stepping inside. In some towns, it was customary to lend strangers a scented cloth to hold over the mouth while speaking. The habit carried into other aspects of life. During burials, mourners sometimes held nosegays to their faces, not as a show of grief, but to guard against the idea of death in the air. Markets sold more herbs than grain during these peaks of fear, and traders from distant regions would arrive with rare spices simply because people believed their fragrance might be worth the price of a month's income. The result was that certain quarters of the city smelled less of plague and more like a sprawling spice cabinet, dense with foreign aromas. Yet even with this constant burning and perfuming, there were no guarantees. Some who lived wrapped in fragrance fell ill regardless, and neighbors with no herbs at all sometimes remained untouched. But the patterns were not entirely random, and over generations families noticed that those who clung to the strongest smelling remedies seemed in some outbreaks to fare better. Without science to explain it, tradition was enough to keep the practice alive. It became as much a social signal as a remedy. Fragrance marked a home as vigilant, its occupants as unwilling to yield to invisible forces. Still, protection was not always scented. For those who could afford to leave, the surest way to avoid foul air was to avoid the city entirely. Eventually, the same narrow lanes filled with smoke and herbs would also be littered with abandoned baskets and silent market booths, as some chose a different kind of armor: distance. Families who believed no scent could save them slipped away under cover of night, trading the perfume of juniper and myrrh for the sharp bite of cold wind in open fields. In some regions, the silence after the plague arrived was deeper than any winter stillness. Villages that once rang with hammer strikes, animal calls, and the chatter of people sat nearly motionless. Dogs wandered in loose packs down the center of dirt roads, pausing to sniff at empty doorways. Wind pressed against warped shutters, rattling them like hands wanting to be let in. These were not abandoned for a season. They had been left with no idea who, if anyone, would return. Entire families vanished not through death, but by choice. When a nearby town reported sickness, when the carts of the sick began to roll in from the edges, doors were pulled shut from the outside and keys thrown into the thatch. Fields of barley were left to ripen without anyone to harvest. Chickens scattered over gardens, their owners already miles away. In the scramble to escape, people took only what could be loaded onto a cart or tied over a shoulder. The logic made sense. If the city air was poisoned, if neighbors had begun to cough, the surest answer was to outrun the danger. But the road was its own battlefield. The same path that led away from plague also held its own threats. Nights spent shivering under thin wool, fingers numb from rain, hunger biting harder than fear. A traveler might dodge one village in the grip of disease only to find the next barring a gate against all outsiders. In some places, whole towns became fortresses overnight. Drawbridges on small river crossings were chained in place. Walls that had been open to travelers were patrolled. It was not uncommon for those still healthy to post lookouts, scanning the horizon for approaching figures. Strangers were told to move on, and if they refused, force solved the problem. A guarded village meant protection for those inside, but for the traveler, it was another closed door in a long chain. Departure was often done in the dark. The cover of night kept others from seeing who had gone and when. Families wrapped babies in extra cloth to keep them quiet as they slipped past sleeping neighbors. Sometimes reaching the bridge or gate meant more than walking. It meant bartering. A few silver coins might convince a drowsy guard to turn his back, though the risk was great for both. For the rich, larger sums ensured a smoother escape. Their carriages rolled out before dawn, servants leading spare horses, sacks of preserved food tucked inside. And the destination mattered. Those with status and land elsewhere could retreat to villas or rural estates, closing themselves off with the same ease other people might lock a single door. The nobility had hunting parks to feed them, wells to draw from, and paid staff to run errands beyond their private walls. Their journeys were not without risk, but they began with advantage. Ordinary townsfolk had no villas or acreages waiting in the hills. Many followed livestock trails into deep woods, where they hid in makeshift shelters of branches and cloth. Some found crumbling roadside chapels or abandoned mill houses to sleep in. Others lingered along riverbanks, using flowing water for drinking and washing, hoping it would keep them clean of whatever carried the sickness. There were people who seemed to live half on the road, moving from place to place at any rumor of illness. Why did leaving sometimes work? The densest clusters of rats and fleas, the hidden carriers, were often in cities, especially near wharves and market stalls where grain spilled in the street and refuse piled high. Rural zones held risk too, but fewer hosts meant slower spread. Early in an outbreak, even a few days of travel could put critical distance between a fleeing family and the reach of contagion. If they stayed in sparsely populated places and avoided newcomers, they might pass months without sickness touching them at all. But even here, luck remained a strong hand. The wind or a single infected traveler could undo weeks of caution. People ran not only from the disease, but from the uncertainty of where it might appear next. This kept them moving, sometimes until they reached natural barriers, mountains, wide rivers, coastlines, where they simply stopped. Each choice carried its own gamble. Those who stayed had to face rising piles of the dead and the constant fear that their own fever would start overnight. Those who left trusted that the dangers of the road were survivable and that the land ahead would take them in. In years when the plague first moved through a region, flight worked more often. People in isolated cottages might only hear of the disease months after it burned through the nearest town. Distance and low population acted like invisible walls. The further one could get from the noise and trade of crowded centers, the longer that fragile protection lasted. There are fragments of stories, small groups reaching summer grazing lands high in the hills, living for a season on goat's milk and coarse bread. Children returning to empty homes months later to find the doors warped in their frames and weeds curling through kitchen floors. Elders leading their families across stretches of open land where for days they did not see another person or hear another human voice. Survival was not certain, but the stillness of these remote refuges must have felt like safety after the fevered air of the city. Yet flight was never an option for all. Many simply could not leave, bound by ties of work, by the care of the ill, or by lack of means for the journey. For them, escape had to take another shape. Some neighborhoods became small fortresses of their own, locking gates not to keep people in, but to control who might come through. Instead of seeking distance, they placed every hope in controlling space. While the roads carried the desperate and the determined away, these stayed, building new boundaries inside the places they already called home. Could cutting yourself off from the world save you? It was a question entire towns had to answer in the shadow of the plague. For some, the choice came in a single night when word spread that the sickness had reached a neighboring market. For others, it was a slow, creeping decision as families counted each new grave and saw the danger drawing closer. If they could keep outsiders out, maybe they could keep death out too. Self-quarantine wasn't a word in their language, but the idea was already there. Communities drew invisible lines around themselves and then made them real with gates, fences, and watchposts. Once the boundaries closed, they stayed closed, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for the better part of a year. Life inside shrank to whatever food, water, and labor was already within the walls. This was safety in trade for freedom, and the trade could be brutal. Inside these sealed spaces, silence settled fast. Trade stopped almost overnight. The carts of grain, oil and salt that normally arrived from outside villages vanished from the roads. Markets became small and repetitive. Turnips from one farm, honey from another. The same goods appearing week after week until stocks ran low. In the first few days, the lack of new faces might have felt like a comfort. Soon after, it became a strain. Without trade, every loaf of bread, every drop of lamp oil had to come from within. The French town of Givry is remembered as one that took this path. Records describe how it shut its gates when the plague tore through nearby lands. Outsiders were turned away, and traders had to exchange goods at controlled points outside the town. Givry's death rate was lower than that of its neighbors, but the people inside paid for that safety with isolation. Even the smallest risk was taken seriously. Messengers from beyond were stopped before they reached the gates, their words passed along by someone standing several feet away. These controlled points, sometimes called plague posts, acted like small fortresses in themselves. Here, goods could be left for collection without direct contact. You might picture a rough wooden bench outside the border, with sacks or jars placed on one end and payment left on another. The trade happened in silence, separated by time and space. It slowed the day's rhythm, but it was better than opening the gates wide. Guard patrols made these restrictions hold. Men in cloaks walked the perimeter at all hours, some carrying staves not as weapons but as symbols of authority. The gates were more than locked, they were watched. Warning bells could sound if someone tried to breach the line. At night, torches lit the main entrances. Anyone approaching could be seen long before they reached the wall. The people relied on one another more than ever, but that didn't make things easier. Food might run low in a bad growing season. A storm could flood the only grain storehouse. If someone inside fell sick, whether from plague or something else, the fear could turn neighbor against neighbor. In some places, guards were tasked not only with keeping strangers out, but also with finding those who might try to slip away or send messages beyond the border. And yet the discipline sometimes paid off. Villages that held out without breaking their own rules could finish a season untouched, while surrounding areas suffered massive losses. In those cases, quarantine was less a wall of stone and more a thin agreement between people to keep each other alive. The rules were sometimes harsh. Those who had been outside the wall without approval might be kept away for more than a week before being allowed back in, their goods burned or washed before touching a market. Within, daily life took on a careful rhythm. Fields inside the boundary were worked steadily, but workers avoided clustering. Religious gatherings thinned or were moved outdoors. Meetings between households often happened across fences rather than inside kitchens. Rumors still crossed the walls faster than people could, but the physical distances were maintained. It was a strange form of community, close independence, apart in contact. Morale was always fragile. The longer the gates stayed shut, the more the tension grew. People missed relatives left on the outside. Children wanted to see friends in nearby towns. Merchants chafed at lost income. The sound of the warning bell at the gate could send a ripple of unease through the crowd, everyone glancing upward at once to guess who had come and why. Fatigue from constant caution was its own kind of threat, but the results could not be ignored. Where villages like Givry managed to hold their isolation without slipping, they emerged with more of their population intact than their neighbors. The unseen enemy didn't care about their walls or their watchmen, but the fleas and rats that spread it had a harder time crossing guarded borders. Even without knowing it, these communities had built a barrier strong enough to slow the invisible reach of the plague. The choice to lock a world inside itself came at a cost. Isolation might save lives in one measure and strain them in another. Families learned to stretch stores of grain and dried beans, to make do without salt fish from the river or cloth from the weaver 3 towns away. Everyone understood that this was a gamble, but it was a gamble they could play together. Some likely wondered if the walls would hold forever or if the disease would eventually arrive as it had everywhere else. Others saw the fortifications as a kind of promise that for as long as the gates stayed shut, they would at least have a fighting chance. Though no one wished to keep the world out forever, the sound of those gates closing meant for that moment they had chosen life over commerce, caution over movement. For certain towns, this shaped not only their survival during the worst years, but their memory for decades after. The walls stood as reminders that sometimes safety came from shrinking the world to fit inside a line you could guard. Yet not everyone trusted stone, guards, and silence to keep them safe. For many, the surest shield was not built from wood or stone at all, but from faith itself. Pilgrimage days could draw hundreds into the same square, kneeling shoulder to shoulder, the air thick with incense and the chant of prayers. In those moments, the crowd itself became a living testament to faith, people believing that closeness to a sacred place could hold back the disaster pressing in from beyond the city walls. Candles burned at makeshift altars and relics were brought out for the faithful to touch. The streets swelled as if danger had been forgotten, replaced by the hope that a blessing or a saint's intercession might create a shield around the body. Not far away, far smaller gatherings hid behind locked gates. Monasteries and convents, aware that contact with the outside could bring the sickness inside, chose the opposite path. Doors closed, sometimes without warning. Visitors were turned away at the walls, begging for shelter that could not be given. Within, the world was reduced to the rhythm of prayer, the tending of gardens, the soft echo of voices rising in stone chapels. For these communities, faith was still the center, but it was practiced in seclusion. They treated the outside as another season of danger to endure until its passing was certain. Faith as a shield could be powerful, but not always in the way people imagined. In large gatherings, the devotion was unmistakable, yet so was the risk. Every touch, every shared cup, every shoulder brushed in a crowded procession could carry more than blessings. The road from one holy site to another often passed through many towns, and those who walked it might bring with them more than their prayers. The very gatherings meant to heal could quicken the disease's journey. Among the most fervent were the flagellants. These groups traveled openly from place to place, stripes of self-inflicted wounds marking their backs. To them, suffering was a path to spiritual cleansing, each blow a step toward easing divine wrath. Crowds gathered to watch, to join in prayer, or to march alongside them for a stretch. But the devotion came with an unseen cost. Moving frequently, the flagellants carried whatever the last town had in its air, leaving behind more than the echo of hymns. With each arrival, the sickness had another chance to find new ground. And yet, in the same years, there were stories of remote abbeys and solitary hermits who emerged long after the plague years without a single case among them. Some had been remote to begin with, their daily lives already built on separation. Monks kept to a strict routine within enclosed walls, their contact limited to those already sharing the cloister. Hermits, living in woodland shelters or caves, drew their sustenance from small gardens and the occasional offering left at a discreet distance. They did nothing for the sake of biology or medicine, yet their habits, avoiding the stream of travelers, working mostly alone, storing food in clean, dry spaces, meant the plague had little chance to enter their lives. Religious discipline itself could have effects beyond its intended aim. Fasting reduced public feasting, lowering the number of large gatherings. Ritual washing before prayer meant cleaner hands and faces, though rarely thought of as sterilization. Certain dietary rules, such as avoiding meats in poor condition or eating more dried and preserved foods, might have limited exposure to pests. These choices were framed in religious duty, but they also built daily practices that sometimes cut down hidden risks. Inside cloisters, the cycle of bells and prayer kept structure intact. This discipline could make isolation bearable. People knew what would happen at each hour, no matter how uncertain the world beyond the walls. The routine itself became a kind of medicine against despair, which was a hazard in its own right. A demoralized household might neglect tasks that kept sickness at bay, cooking properly, tending to water supplies, cleaning sleeping spaces. Faith, anchoring the mind in purpose, could also anchor the body in safer patterns of living. In towns, merchants and artisans who were deeply tied to parish life often found themselves balancing fervor against caution. A devout family might attend a reduced mass, standing apart from others, avoiding the traditional kiss of peace, while still trusting in the service to bring comfort. Some processions changed form, with participants walking in narrower lines or carrying relics to be viewed from doorways instead of passing through dense, touching crowds. These adaptations show that the two impulses, belief and self-preservation, could shape each other, even in moments of fear. There were also moments when religious leadership directly urged restraint. A bishop might order certain shrines to be closed to pilgrims or move major feasts to later in the year. For devout communities, such commands carried weight. Compliance meant reframing piety not as exposure to holy sites, but as obedience to a directive meant to preserve life. The understanding was not medical, but it was pragmatic. A recognition that keeping the faithful well was also an act of service to the divine. Faith could inspire extraordinary endurance in isolation. Nuns, confined to their convents during outbreaks, sometimes took on roles as caregivers for the frail among their own number, reducing the chance that illness left someone untended. Monks kept meticulous stores of grain and oil, rationing with fairness so that no one weakened from hunger. In these ways, spiritual communities often emerged with more of their number intact, though not immune to loss. What separated their outcomes from those of the larger population was not only seclusion, but the order that faith encouraged within their walls. And still many outside those walls saw faith as the only true refuge. They did not weigh risk the way we might now. They weighed the state of the soul over the state of the body. Processions continued, pilgrimages resumed, and the flagellants still walked their circuits. But scattered among them were individuals and groups who blended their belief with cautious practice, limiting contact, controlling who entered their circles, and holding fast to rituals that kept their surroundings cleaner, their gatherings smaller. It was in this blending that faith most clearly served survival. Devotion gave the reason to endure hardship, while measured habits reduced the chance of falling ill. For some, salvation depended on reaching a holy place or performing a sacred act. For others, it lay in holding the sacred within, closing the gates and letting the outside world wait. Yet whether the choice was to stand in the thick of a crowd or kneel in the stillness of a shuttered chapel, faith was never the whole of survival. Outside the realm of prayer, other eyes were watching, not heavenward, but for the first signs of sickness, ready to act before the danger reached full strength. Who first noticed the signs before the bell tolled, before the streets fell silent? Long before anyone understood the plague's cause, there were people in every town whose work kept them close to the sick, healers, midwives, and barber surgeons. They had no cures to offer, yet they developed ways to read the body for danger. A sudden swelling at the neck, a blotch that deepened in hours, a fever no water could ease. They were the ones to see these patterns repeat, long before the rest understood what was coming. Their role was not marked by the fine robes of physicians in the great cities. Instead, they carried small chests of tools, cloth rolls stuffed with herbs, or pots of ointment mixed from whatever ingredients could be found. A healer in a fishing village might keep a notebook, sketching the marks she saw on the skin of each patient. A midwife could tell when a newborn's mother showed signs that had appeared in another family across town. These fragments of knowledge, gathered through repetition, formed a silent map of the disease's path. They began to act on what they noticed, Houses with the sick might be left undisturbed for days except for food passed at the door. Bedding was sometimes burned in the yard after its owner died. If vermin were seen on a patient's clothes, efforts were made to crush or sweep them away. These choices came not from theory, but from seeing what had gone wrong before. If a whole household fell after sharing the bed of a fevered child, perhaps no one should lie there again. Some methods looked simple, even crude. A barber surgeon in one port town wore a cloth across his mouth, tied at the back of his head. He could not have named germs, but he knew the cloth kept the worst of the stench from entering his lungs, and perhaps that mattered. Tools, knives, razors, lances might be boiled before the next use. A healer who insisted on tending the sick in open courtyards rather than closed rooms would say the fresh air kept spirits stronger, yet without knowing it, she allowed ventilation that thinned the invisible hazard within. The strength of these measures was in their consistency. Observant healers repeated them not as experiments, but as habits. In some fishing ports, anyone showing certain signs was moved to a small hut at the edge of the shore road. Family visits happened through a window or over a fence. In farming villages, one person might be assigned as the only contact for the sick, reducing the spread through other households. It was a rough form of containment, born from pattern and memory. In coastal towns, quick recognition could mean everything. Ships carried goods and passengers from far-off places, and stowing away with them were rats. The moment a dock worker fell ill, local healers watched others on the crew. If more became sick, whole shiploads of cargo might be left untouched on the pier. Some communities even quarantined the crews on their vessels, refusing to unload a single crate until days had passed without new cases. There are accounts of towns where such swiftness blunted what could have been a full outbreak, leaving daily life disturbed but not destroyed. But for those who went toward the sickness instead of fleeing it, risk was constant. Barber surgeons were called to lance boil-like swellings, a task done at close range. Midwives might tend the ill late into the night, holding their hands as fever turned to chills. Herb women cleaned and dressed wounds, crushed leaves in bowls, and leaned close to help others drink. There was no protection except the small measures they had learned, and many fell sick in turn. Some worked until their own hands began to shake from fever, leaving the task to an apprentice or to no one at all. The danger was not only in direct contact. A healer walking through the poorer quarters might pass through cramped lanes where waste gathered in gutters. In these places, fleas found plenty of hosts. Without meaning to, the healer could carry them home in a seam or fold of cloth. Burning travel clothes after a day's work was one of the measures a few began to take, though it was costly. Yet, again and again, the difference between communities that suffered heavily and those that lost fewer lay in who was watching and how fast they acted. Separation, destruction of contaminated bedding, careful handling of the sick, these slowed the invisible tide. The knowledge was not shared through books, but through practice, taught from one pair of hands to the next. Even so, survival was more than the absence of disease. A village with quick-acting healers still had to endure the wait, wondering if the last bout of sickness was truly the final one. People counted the days since the last fever, wary of celebrating too soon. And while they waited, the healers kept their watch, noticing a cough here, an unusual mark there, ready to repeat the same precautions again if needed. In the absence of cure, constancy became its own form of medicine. Every time a healer insisted that the sick be moved outdoors, someone was protected from the thick air inside. Each burned mattress meant fewer places for fleas to hide. Every pot boiled clean before the next use cut down the chance of carrying danger from one patient to another. These measures were silent, almost invisible compared to the tolling bells and shuttered markets. Yet they shaped the course of survival as surely as any wall or prayer. The work was steady and unglamorous, often unrewarded. but it drew the line between one household falling and a whole street collapsing into grief. Still, even the most careful watcher could not guard the mind against the weight of fear. Long weeks of tension wore down judgment, frayed trust, and dulled the will to keep the routines that held danger at bay. Keeping the body safe required skill and observation. Keeping the mind from surrendering was another challenge altogether. Through a gap in the shutters, the street beyond lay almost still. One stray dog drifting past, a cart left standing in the shadow of a wall. Inside, a few candles lit the room where a family sat near the hearth. A boy worked the bellows for a small fire while his sister plucked slow notes on a lute. Their mother kept time against the table with the flat of her hand. The song was not loud, and yet it felt like a wall of sound, holding back the silence pressing from outside. In those moments, no one looked toward the door. Keeping the mind steady could be as critical as finding clean water. Fear had weight, and when carried for weeks or months, it could crush motivation to perform even the simplest task. When households fell into despair, meals grew irregular, cleaning was left undone, and essential work in the fields or workshops stopped. In the winter of an outbreak, that neglect could be as deadly as the sickness itself. Some communities found quiet methods to resist that slide. In neighborhoods not yet overcome, small gatherings took place inside shared courtyards. A few families might meet in the open air, each seated apart, telling stories while grinding grain or repairing tools. The work and the talk merged into one rhythm, making the hours pass and reminding people that they were not facing the season alone. In better times, such moments might have been overlooked. During plague years, they became acts of care. Even trading could be arranged to stir the mind. Market days shrank in size but were not erased entirely. In some towns, a handful of stalls opened in a square twice a week, spaced farther apart, where goods were exchanged quickly and voices carried cautiously across the distance. There was an unspoken satisfaction in seeing familiar faces still alive, still working. These reduced markets fed more than the stomach. They offered proof that daily life could continue in some form. Inside homes, routines took on the role of anchor. A family might keep the same hours they had known before the plague, even when work had dwindled. Bread was baked each morning, whether in plenty or in ration. Floors swept at midday, lamps filled at night. The repetition held back the formless days that could sink the spirit. Parents often kept their children occupied with simple lessons or tasks, knowing that idleness made them restless, and restlessness could lead to risk outside the safety of home. Music was not the only comfort. Storytelling became a nightly habit in places where families clustered together. Old tales, half-remembered histories, even the recounting of past seasons' harvests took on a new value. In retelling these stories, people threaded the present moment into a longer line, making it part of something that had survived before. That link in memory could soften the edge of the unknown. When these acts were repeated, they began to produce more than comfort. A community that insisted on its small rituals, sweeping, cooking, gathering in measured numbers, tended also to maintain the habits that had a direct impact on health. Floors cleared of debris and food prepared on time were simple tasks that reduced pests and kept bodies stronger. The mind might have been the first target of these routines, but the body gained from them too. Records from certain towns suggest that where such morale was actively protected, recovery came quicker once the outbreak passed. It was not because the sickness spared them entirely, but because the community's structure had not collapsed. People were ready to return to full work faster. Fields were tended before they were lost to weeds, and families still had enough store to last until trade routes reopened. There was also a quiet, sometimes unspoken defiance in these practices. Holding a small feast for a household on the anniversary of a birth, eating from the better plates on a midwinter night, or hanging a wreath of herbs above the door were gestures that said life could still be marked and remembered. To a neighbor looking on, such choices might offer more than hope. They could be an example to follow. Not every attempt to keep spirits high succeeded. In places where disease hit hardest, the weight of loss could flatten such efforts. Yet even then, there were households that kept one or two customs alive. A song sung while baking, a blessing said over water before drinking. Small things repeated often enough to build a thread of continuity. That thread could keep the mind from turning wholly toward despair. It is possible to see why such communities held together better in hardship. When a group agreed, silently or openly, to avoid sinking into the habits of mourning before they were forced to, they left themselves energy to act when it was needed. They checked on neighbors from a distance, kept accounts of food, and noticed when something was wrong in time to respond. That collective alertness worked alongside healers' practical measures, forming a second layer of defense not against fleas or fever, but against the erosion of will. Children often carried the strongest memories of these times. Years later they spoke of the winters when the world outside had gone quiet, yet inside there had been music, or the smell of bread, or the scrape of a stool across the floor to join a circle of stories. In their memory, those moments did not erase the suffering, but they stood as proof that their families had chosen to keep living, even in small ways. Such acts turned survival into more than the absence of death. They gave it texture and rhythm, making it possible to face each day without being swallowed by the fear of what might come tomorrow. People who could still laugh, work, and share within safe limits were people who could keep the fabric of their lives from unraveling entirely. And in that intact fabric lay the readiness to rebuild when the danger finally receded. When the sound of the bells faded and the notices of the dead grew fewer, the air carried a different weight. Streets opened again, but what they revealed was not the same as before. Shops stood shuttered, fields half-tended, and in many houses the strongest had been lost. Those who had kept their minds steady were suddenly faced with work of a different kind, sifting through what remained and shaping it into the beginnings of a new life. The first signs of the plague's retreat were not silence, but the gradual return of sound. A hammer striking wood in a half-collapsed workshop, the creak of a door's hinges after months untouched. Yet what lay before those sounds was stark. Fields once straight-lined with grain stood in uneven patches, weeds curling around the edges. In some orchards, the fruit had dropped and rotted at the base of the trunks. Workshops were littered with tools left mid-use, rust already claiming their edges. Roofs had sagged under the weight of a year without repair, their tiles slipping to the ground below. For those who walked back into these spaces, there was little time to stand still. The plague had taken not only family and neighbors, but also the hands that worked the fields, mended the wagons, and baked the bread. In villages where half the population was gone, there were more empty houses than occupied ones. Leadership, too, had thinned. Town officials, elders, and trade leaders were sometimes missing entirely, leaving quarrels over who had the right to decide the next steps. Against this backdrop, survival meant turning from a season of hiding to one of action. The lack of labor was immediate and visible, fields gone wild for want of workers, carts rotting because no carpenter was left to fix their wheels. Some saw little hope in the mess, convinced that whole settlements would never rise again. Others looked at the same abandoned barns and saw them as invitations, land left open, homes ready for the taking. Those who had endured the sickness or avoided it entirely began weighing how much could be claimed and made usable again. Inheritance shifted rapidly, with many households wiped out or left with only a single heir. Property and goods changed hands at a pace unknown before. It was not uncommon for a child still in their early teens to become the owner of land or a business, managing it with the help of relatives or trusted neighbors. Orphaned nieces and nephews were taken in by uncles who now also held the deeds to their late parents' farms. In some regions, the law bent to accommodate the sheer number of claims, accepting new arrangements that would never have passed in calmer times. Those with skill in high demand gained a new standing. Surviving masons, millers, and smiths could command greater payment for their work, and they knew it. Agreements made before the plague were set aside as laborers demanded better wages or resources in return for their trade. For workers used to being one among many, the change was profound. A single weaver might now set terms with the merchants, knowing there were few others left to match their output. Not every village could rebuild where it stood. Some lay empty for years, their homes falling into ruin until new settlers arrived. People from outlying areas who claimed the land and reshaped its layout. A few abandoned villages were merged into stronger ones nearby, their remaining residents bringing whatever could be carried before their old homes were reclaimed by grass and rain. In other cases, survivors cleared the weeds from familiar ground, patching thatched roofs and repairing stone walls as best they could until the rhythms of planting and harvest returned. Adapting to the new order extended beyond work and ownership. Social ties shifted quickly, especially where the balance between men and women had altered. Marriages were arranged sooner than planned, sometimes within weeks of a family loss, in part to secure property or keep a household's labor intact. Young men and women who had known each other from childhood found themselves pushed into union by the urgent need to stabilize what was left. In towns, widows with means could now choose from suitors eager to align themselves with wealth or trade connections. Trade routes began to stir again, but with heavy caution. Where once a caravan might have moved freely from market to market, now there were checkpoints and appointed places for exchange. Goods were sometimes inspected or left in open air before being taken in, an unspoken nod to the memory of how quickly sickness had traveled in years past. Merchants recorded new contacts, assessing which suppliers had survived and which would never send goods again. That process reshaped long-standing networks, cementing new alliances in trade even as old ones dissolved. The knowledge that another outbreak could come was never far from thought. In farming areas, spare grain was stored in multiple locations rather than in a single communal barn, spreading the risk should misfortune strike again. Wells were redug in safer places, away from runoff that might carry illness. Even in the act of rebuilding, there was a measured pace, as if hoping not to draw unwanted attention from fate itself. Older customs remained, but adapted to new conditions. Annual fairs returned, yet on a smaller scale, with traders spaced farther apart. Town meetings were held in larger halls to avoid the closeness once taken for granted. Children learned the work of adults earlier, not as a choice but as a necessity, filling the gaps left in every craft and household. For some, this meant skills were passed into younger hands before they were ready. For others, it meant new energy rushing into old trades. Rebuilding was not simply work for survival. It became an active measure of resilience. The ones who made the most of the changed economy were often those willing to shift with it. A tenant farmer who seized the chance to lease additional land might lift their family into stability. A merchant who replaced lost contacts with entirely new routes could keep their stall open when others fell silent. Adaptability itself became a tool as valuable as land or coin. Even as homes were repaired and fields filled again with crops, the landscape held traces of all that had been lost. Rows of untended graves marked the edges of roads. Empty plots in the heart of towns would not be built on for years, left as uneasy reminders. And yet, where there were signs of ruin, there were also signs of continued life. Smoke curling from chimneys that had been cold for seasons, animals returning to rebuilt pens, market stalls set up in corners where weeds had been scraped away. From these years of rebuilding came not only stronger walls and fresh harvests, but also lessons worked into the habits of daily life. Decisions made in the shadow of the plague hardened into customs and, later, into the stories told to explain them. In the quiet of long evenings, survivors passed those stories to their children, framing them as examples of what to do when food runs short, when neighbors vanish, when the air itself feels dangerous. Over time, the origins of those instructions blurred, but their shape remained, carried forward as if the echo of those years still spoke through the hands that rebuilt. In some homes, there are small habits that no one can quite explain. An old cloth slipped under the doorframe on a certain week in spring, a fire lit in the yard when the air feels heavy though the day is warm, a basin of water placed by the doorway during the first market of the month. Ask why, and the answer might be, it's just what we do, as if the reason had never mattered. Yet these quiet acts are the last traces of choices made long ago, in years when forgetting them could mean your life. What began as urgent measures during a time of plague drifted into tradition as centuries passed. The facts that gave them shape faded first. Few remembered that smoke from a certain herb was once used to drive away the fleas that carried death from house to house. No one told the full story of why strangers were not to be welcomed past the threshold without a sign from the head of the household. Instead, these rules became folded into the fabric of life. Some as good manners, others as seasonal rituals. By the time the original danger was gone, the habits themselves remained. Over generations, their edges, sometimes softened, the meaning replaced with gentler explanations. Where once people stayed home on a plague day, it might now be framed as a saint's feast or a day of rest after the planting season. Gathering smoke in a closed room, once an urgent task to clear bad air, might survive as the custom of lighting a certain incense on a specific day. The threat that had given the act its shape was gone, but the act endured. In parts of rural Europe, especially in isolated valleys, you can still find customs that might be echoes of those older measures. In some villages, there is one market day each year when no visiting traders are allowed. Locals see it as a matter of tradition. They say their town looks after itself on that date. But long ago, it may have been a method to break the chain of sickness carried by travelers. Elsewhere, households still burn specific plants on the same evening each summer. It's said to keep away insects or bad fortune. Recorded hints suggest those days once marked the approach of a dangerous season. Some towns keep the closing ritual alive without fully knowing why. At sundown on a certain evening, families close their shutters and bring all tools and baskets indoors. In past centuries, this may have been the start of a community-wide isolation, a moment when the town stopped movement in or out for a set number of days. Today, it is more likely to be called a holiday tradition, a symbolic pause with little thought given to its origin. Oral tradition carried these patterns forward. Grandparents told the younger ones, "This is how it's done," often leaving out the darker stories attached to each practice. Sometimes the meaning was unspoken because the memory of plague was too heavy. Other times it was simply forgotten as the generations turned. The shape of the custom stayed the same, even as its purpose emptied out. Like a word in an old song whose language is no longer spoken, the form survived even without its definition. Selective memory shaped what was kept. Practices that were easy to repeat stayed on. Burning herbs in the hearth once a year took little effort. Holding a feast indoors instead of traveling for it was simple enough to maintain. The rules that demanded greater sacrifice, weeks of total isolation for example, were the first to vanish after the immediate danger was past. What remained were the fragments that fit comfortably into ordinary life, stripped of the urgency that had made them necessary. In these fragments is a record of ingenuity, even if it is wrapped in superstition. A wreath hung in a particular window each spring may seem like decoration. Long ago, its pungent leaves might have signaled to neighbors that the occupants were willing to trade from a distance but not to open their door. A small pouch of dried plants carried during a village fair could appear as a charm, but it once served as part of the scent shield meant to block dangerous air. The customs that lasted longest were often the ones that worked on several levels. Lighting a smoky fire in the yard might mark a holiday, repel insects from the garden, and, by accident, keep away the creatures once responsible for carrying plague. Avoiding close contact with foreign traders on certain days could be explained as courtesy or religious observance, while incidentally reducing the risk of bringing sickness into the community. People did not need to remember the second reason if the first was enough to keep the act alive. Centuries after the plague's height, people still obeyed these inherited rules without fully asking why. By then, science began offering different explanations for disease and health, yet these old measures continued alongside newer ideas. They resisted complete erasure because they were no longer just emergency responses. They had become part of identity. To skip them would feel like breaking faith with the generations before, even if the original fear had vanished. There is a certain resilience in this kind of inheritance. It shows that the human response to crisis is not only to react in the moment, but also to weave the memory of survival into daily routine. Even when the exact cause is lost, the protective shape remains. In this way, the voices of those who lived through the worst years still speak, not in words, but in the rhythm of the year, the arrangement of a room, the choice to do something, the way it's always been done. These inherited gestures are like faint images under a newer painting, their outlines only visible if you know where to look. Each one carries an echo of decisions made in times when every choice was sharpened by urgency. People once set their lives around them in order to keep death at a distance. Now, they persist as signals of belonging, of continuity, and perhaps, without anyone realizing it, as quiet safeguards. What remains after the facts have faded is not a full record of what happened, but a distilled set of actions that someone long ago found worth repeating. In their survival across centuries, they prove that persistence itself can be a form of memory. The true strength was never only in walls or in flight or in smoke. It was in the ability to notice what worked, carry it forward and pass it on, even in altered form. That ability to adapt, to bind new ways of living into custom, is what allowed so many to face the unseen threat and leave a trace for those who came after. And while the names and explanations have shifted with time, the instinct behind them remains unchanged, echoing the same drive that shaped the first fragile victories against the plague. Survival in the Black Death years was never just chance. People built it piece by piece, through smoke-filled doorways, guarded gates, watchful eyes, and the stubborn keeping of small daily rites. These acts, born in fear, became patterns that outlasted the plague itself. Even now, some linger in the way we respond to threats we cannot see. A habit, a rule, a pause in movement, all carry echoes of those hard-learned lessons. Survival was not a miracle. It was a deliberate mosaic of choices, each one adding to the chance of seeing another day, and together altering the path of history forever.